Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very happy to be here, and thanks a lot to Arijit and Marie-Laure for the confirmation of the contribution today. The topic is on qualitative geography, and I think I need to clarify what I have in mind, talking of qualitative geography. Actually, I think I will not use the slides. I have some slides, you have them here, but it's very scarce. I use them really, but anyway, I will clarify some points. When I talk of qualitative geography, I have in mind an opposition to a quantitative approach of geography, and I'd like a lot that we started with Professor Chatterjee yesterday against the notion of the world being flat. And the two discussions this morning show that we have, and of course the keynote conference yesterday by Professor Sassen showed that we have a power issue, and the question should be, the world is flat, but for whom? And who has some interest in a flat power, a flat world? Sorry. And my point is that we should insist and make room for an understanding of qualitative approach of places, not only of space, places which are not measurable, but on the basis of people perspective. And I have in mind the trend in philosophy of phenomenology, how people appropriate space, making sense of their daily lives and making sense of places, and not only living in a neutral, well, supposedly neutral space. And one of the stakes confronting qualitative approach of geography, of space or places, and quantitative is understanding what Marie-Laure alluded to this morning of what has been called the end of history. And I think we cannot avoid questioning the notion of end of history. So my presentation will be going towards an understanding of day-to-day sense-making processes, individual sense-making processes and collective ones, through a questioning of the notion of end of history, and on this basis, questioning the notion of utopia. I was very interested that we are in a room called the Possibility Room. I like the title. And I like that we can imagine we have a future. There has been a long time since people said, no future. And we have a future, actually. The world has a future, I'm convinced. But I think if we are not convinced, we kill the world. So we should be convinced we have a future. So I think the room is particularly relevant here. And so the second point will be working on the notion of utopia. And I think it's interesting for geographers working on nowhere. But places which are not located, maybe are located in our imagination, our desire, and as Marie-Laure said this morning, our dreams. So we need to make room for dreams again, and I call it making room for day-to-day sense-making, which means making room for qualitative approach of places that we value on various ways, but which are not neutral, never. Artists are excellent representatives of qualitative approach of places. So first, let's have a look to the notion of end of history. To be very clear, I do not approve the way Francis Fukuyama made the notion very famous. When he wrote his book, which is very famous, of course, The End of History and the Last Man, it's a very interesting book. But it is a certain way of understanding the notion of end of history which needs to be traced back to previous philosophers. One is the German philosopher Hegel, but more recently there is a Franco-Russian philosopher who is not very renowned, but very, very important for the understanding of the notion of end of history, whose name is Alexandre Kojève. And Kojève insisted on a very important point in Hegel philosophy, and we have been discussing it, I think, so far, because he makes clear that history on the perspective of Hegel, is understandable on the basis of a dialectic, but which is a fight between people who will become, some of them will become masters, and some others will become the slaves. And history is but the process through which people discover they can get rid of masters and liberate themselves and become real citizens. And what is the argument? I can only sum up, just sketch it here, but just, it is that the end of history is the end of the process through which humanity became aware that people could become free. That's all. But it's radically important. And my point is, if we do forget about it, we make room for tyranny again. We favor powers. We favor power from people who want to remain masters, to have nature or the world under control, and we favor that people remain slaves, on the other hand. So the point is, okay, history evidently is not over. I mean, we have been talking of power since yesterday, financial power, ideological power, geopolitical power, etc. So of course, there are some fights, and history is not over. We are not in a peaceful world. But the Hegel and Kojève argument is, there was once when humans could write about an ideal constitutional state where everybody would recognize, respected in his individuality. And these would be written and would be legalized. This is crucial. My point is, we cannot forget about this intention. It remains a utopia. There is no any state where everybody is actually recognized. But some states, some nations, some networks in their culture are closer to a universal, potentially universal, tendentially universal recognition, and some are not. This remains a utopia. My point is, if we forget about it, again, we go back to silence, tyranny, violence, much more than we already do. So we have a kind of a duty to remember that this has been a possibility written at least once, and actually I can tell you it's written, on my perspective, I think there is a very important Kojève book which title is An Outline of a Phenomenology of Right. And the word right is crucial. And he writes what would be the main principles of such a state or a world which recognizes everybody in his dignity. And Kojève argues that such a state should be universal because you cannot expels anybody. You cannot make people become invisible and, marginalize them first. Second, if you cannot add it to be universal, such a state would be homogeneous, socially homogeneous, and ideally it would be constituted, as the Greek philosopher Aristotle would have put it, by a universal middle class. You would not have people becoming, fewer and fewer people becoming richer and richer, and on the other hand, more and more people becoming power and more power and more power, like Marx diagnosed during the 19th century. So this is the utopia. How does it work? I'd like to compare this with the first Western utopia we have in history, in Western civilization, but I think it concerns worldwide, humans as such. This is written in a very important book from Plato, the Greek philosopher, which is called The Republic. And some characteristics of the Republic are very strange because they're very close to our world. Plato describes in the Republic a transparent world. And we have to think of how much we do like transparency nowadays. We would like everything to be transparent. We would like to have nature, human and non-human nature, under control. And Plato had the same intention. He said this is the only way to guarantee that justice may be realized. So transparency, but transparency would have a consequence. I cannot enter into the details, but we can come back during the discussion if you like about it. But one of the consequences is that private life would disappear. Which means that you cannot guarantee public justice, but eliminating private life. And we can be tranquil with this. Plato makes explicit that realizing the republic would be imposing let's say, a universal tyranny. So he's aware of the consequences. My point is here that we need utopias. We need to think of worlds which would become just, perfectly just. But we need to be prudent with utopias as well. Maybe, as Plato alludes, well, he makes clear that if we try to impose a republic such the one he sketches in his book, we will build a tyranny. And maybe certain ideologies tried to do so the last century, to impose, to create perfect regimes. And this would be the danger of a real end of history. So my position is quite ambiguous, but I think we cannot avoid ambiguity. We need to desire perfection. We need never to reach it. It's quite uncomfortable. But I think this is very close to the German philosopher Kant's position. He dreams of perfection. He's particularly renowned about his identification of what he calls the categorical imperative in morals. We need to dream of perfection, but we will never reach it. And we can add, we should never reach it. But this is quite easy because actually we will never do. I think we can be very sure. We can try and try and try and we will never reach it. I mean, tyranny is always endangering perfection, moral perfection, happiness, universality and homogeneity of such an ideal state. But why should we continue desiring it? Because this is life. And I'd like to switch to a third point, which is a real problem. And Professor Sassen alluded to this on my point of view yesterday, dealing with financial issues. And I'd like to deal with this point, which is the strength of technologies. Just to give an example, when Plato writes his Republic, he says that reproduction, humans' reproduction, would be under control of doctors, of philosophers, of physicists, and they would control, and this would make that humans would become perfect. This is the origin of Western eugenism. Can we say eugenism? And I think we have now the technologies to reach this level. And my point here is technologies, be them financial, biological, industrial, nuclear, etc., are quite dangerous. And I'd like that we have in mind here the very important, let's say, the advice of the great philosopher, quite ambiguous as well, Heidegger, who used to say, technologies are very dangerous and they are the result of what we call the Western metaphysics. They are the continuation. And he thinks that technologies are a real danger for humans. And here I come to day-to-day sense-making. I think we can formulate this putting that when we use technological devices, when humans use technologies, they are responsible for technologies and not the contrary. And we are evaluating towards a world where technologies become progressively an insidious way responsible for humans. I would just like to make clear the gravity of the problem, alluding to the catastrophe which occurred in the Air France flight some years ago, in the Rio-Paris flight. There was a moment where pilots could not control the plane, but the plane was controlling them. And they could not differentiate clearly between their own actions, I would call their own sense-making, in the crisis situation, and the technological system. This may have occurred in finance in 2008. This is the same. Very complex systems, be them a plane or a financial system or a nuclear power plant, etc. Very complex technologies which impose themselves to humans, and we do not know how to reappropriate technologies. And unfortunately, technologies, their strength, would be one of the aspects of this famous universal and homogeneous state. Kojève very clearly says we will reach end of history when humans will have nature under control and when they will replace nature by technologies. So we can ask, should we really pursue this idea, this utopia? Again, I think we will never reach it. But one of the prudent attitude would be, let's be very careful and take into account the importance of the devices we use on the basis of on our daily lives. And how do I come back to geography with this? I'm thinking of the GPS. We all have the systems. It's so easy to make us where we are able to go anywhere. But the question is, what for? And the machine cannot answer for us. We would like to go somewhere, but the machine will never be able to tell us why. We are the ones who can say why I do want to go to such a restaurant or to a university or to another place, which means that technologies make us able to square all our world, to build a flat measure of all the places we could go, but we are the ones who value or do not value places. We are the ones who make sense of our movements or not. We are the ones who, on the basis of our daily lives, construct the meaning of space and time. Space and time don't depend, well, we do not depend on space and time. They depend on us. This was one of the most important recent discovery in philosophy, through the phenomenology precisely. And I'd like to use an example. I don't know how many minutes, okay? But very quickly, an example I alluded to talking with some of you yesterday, and is, well, when I talk of making sense, I am using the works of Carl Weick. I think he's really very, very interesting. Carl Weick is a cognitivist and social scientist who works on organizational behavior in crisis situations. And he shows that people in crisis particularly can make sense of a situation positively or negatively, dampen a crisis or deepen it. And he has a very good example. In Poland, before and preparing the Solidarność movement and revolution, there were some people who decided to behave very peacefully, very quietly, but very clearly, as if the world was already better. And they succeeded. He shows very precisely how their attitude spread and made people believe that freedom was possible. My point is, if we favor that people integrate that they are responsible for space, they will favor the creation of new places. Places which means meaningful space, meaningful future, and making room for real innovation and dream. I think we need it. And this is what I try to call qualitative geography. And again, this is my last point. Artists are quite interesting in understanding. They always have a qualitative understanding of the places they like and the ones they dislike, etc. I think we should think of it and deepen this. Okay, I hope I was not too long on the. Thank you.
Oh, it was a very interesting presentation. I want to make a distinction between what is called unattainable perfection, which is basically you're looking at, not you along with, you quoted Plato, and probably I would include John Rawls into it also, arrangements, what is the perfect arrangement, which is unattainable. So why not just reduce manifest injustice, which is very easy to see today, people dying of hunger, half of millions of children are malnourished. So why go for something that is like a unattainable ideal when we can actually see injustice and reduce it, and then actually, reduce injustice, you get towards a more just world.
Actually, I like a lot of your point. Two reactions, not answers, but two reactions. The first one would be, maybe it's not unattainable. What I mean is that if an analysis of the Kojève book on the phenomenology of right, I think, would show that many laws already are in this scope and make people benefit in certain places of real freedom to a certain extent. But it's always to be renegotiated. And second reaction, I think we have to relearn, and I like your point on unattainability, we have to relearn about Aristotle's sense of moderation. I'd like to remind this. Aristotle said Marx was a genius. No, excuse me. Marx said Aristotle was a genius. Otherwise, maybe Aristotle is still alive. I don't know. But, see, the innovation. So, Marx admired Aristotle, but he said, he's a petit bourgeois. Aristotle is a conservative. He has no sense of revolution. Aristotle, in his politics, asks for a middle class. But the point would be, maybe he was right. Because the revolutions we tried, the last century, had huge, sometimes catastrophic effects. And not due to the content of the ideology, but maybe due to the unattainability of the dream. The error we committed maybe was to believe we could implement the Republic, and we should reread the statement where, end of the book 9 of the Republic, Plato makes Socrates put very clearly, don't try to impose the Republic. Just leave the possibility that chance makes it come by itself. But don't try to impose it. And the point would be, maybe we should wait for much more moderate expectations, and maybe we could reach, through small wins, better situations. But never desperate. And this was my point on reminding about the notion of end of history. We are born to become free. This should be solidly implemented in our memories, I think.
Laurent, that was wonderful. This is Saskia Sassen. That was a wonderful talk. And really, I have so many points where I would like to engage, but I'm just going to make two comments.
Let's have a coffee together.
Right. Drinks. This has to be discussed over good cognac, so to speak. But so one is, I'm really very, I'm noticing that you invoke Kojève, who I think is really a very compelling thinker, very little known in the United States, by the way. I mean, people really, they may know the name vaguely. So I thought, and I don't want to repeat the points you made, but it is really, he's a very significant author, it seems to me. And there is a group, especially of legal scholars, with whom I'm in contact, who are really trying, it doesn't mean enacting Kojève's project, but it means sort of going digging in there, decoding, understanding what is the dynamic that he is mentioning. The second point, and here I would just like to run past you a couple of ideas that came to my mind when I was hearing you talk. And one of them is a proposition: no formal system of power lasts forever. Right? So it's a relationship to power and its imperfection, and in there for me lies also, and here there is perhaps a link with Kojève, I don't know, the fact that power systems do not know how to govern themselves. So finance is a very good example, right? So this elementary relationship that we tend to have with power, you either have, which comes a bit from Weber, I think, you either have it or you don't have it, I find extremely problematic. And if you take a sufficiently long temporal frame, you can see that powerless actors actually wind up making history, that their powerlessness becomes complex, but they may not get empowered. And in the Anglo imagination, again, we have a real confinement, which is, okay, so you don't have power. If something good happens, it means you are empowered, right? This term empowered. Well, I think there's a lot of history that gets made, in the shadow of powerlessness and empowerment. And so when you were talking just now, you mentioned, you used the word attitudes, that those who do not have power, that those that you were also alluding to. And I think it's actually also material practices, number one. Attitudes for me is a very problematic term. Maybe because, again, I live in the United States where attitudes is just, left and right. It gets mentioned. It's sort of a word that isn't working for me. And so one is the question of material practices of people, right? That often the powerless find themselves in projects where their material practices might become a bridge into a kind of history-making process. And I think when I mentioned the working slum as opposed to the ghetto where people are just sitting and waiting, the working slum is a space of making, a working slum, not a slum of misery. Now, the second point is that I have sort of really tried to look at historiographies of diverse kinds to understand the following question. Do the powerless make history, but with temporal framings that are much longer than the temporal framings through which power makes history? And secondly, if the powerless in making those histories do not become empowered, their history making becomes invisible. So we may see an outcome. Think of the civil rights movement in the United States. So one day the legislature passed a law and it was, oh my God, we have a law now. Well, behind that are generations of fighting. So again, this question of what is visible and what is invisible. But I just wanted to run this past you. You don't have to really respond, but maybe we can pick it up later.
Respond I could not, but I would like to react on one point, which is very interesting, is that an allusion of Plato in the Republic is that you can compare and echo directly the smallest entity, which would be the individual, and the biggest one, which would be the whole or the city. Maybe we are in such a situation nowadays, which would mean that each individual can echo through various kind of networks and situation dynamics to the whole world. This doesn't mean we have the responsibility of the whole world on our shoulders. This means that we have a life which meaning is directly correlated. And the second point is I fully approve on invisibility. And on power, I'd like just to mention that the Kalvik studies on leadership and power have as a conclusion that the more you empower others, the more you get power. And this is not a very, fashionable idea. People get power for themselves and they think they get it just eliminating others. And he states, no, you have a real power to react if you empower really people around you, invisible ones included. But I'd like to proceed on this discussion on invisibility. It's really crucial. I approve of the long run action of invisible people. That's right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.